Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are economists, scientists, politicians, academics, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, and ecological crises that we face today, and they reveal their solutions to mitigate the damage to our future. This is a critical time for our planet. It demands critical thinking. Click the subscribe button now and go to planetcritical.com to learn more. This week is an episode of solutions, people. I spoke with Henrik Nordborg, who is a theoretical physicist, an engineer, and all-round energy expert, about his global climate compensation idea. For the past few years, Henrik has been working on this idea of how do we get the world economy to transition away from fossil fuels using market mechanisms, which will speak to the most, pragmatic business as usual people out there, and also then redistribute money towards the global south or developing nations so that they can also get a chance to develop without depending on the fossil fuel industry in the way that the West did, and therefore engage in climate discussions at conferences like COP with an effective consensus of decarbonizing. Because right now, essentially, what we're seeing is the most vulnerable nations are not willing to give up access to fossil fuels because they're very, very worried about their development. Whether or not that intention is entirely true, frankly, that's where they're sticking. So we need to do something about it. Henrik's idea, this global climate compensation, would tax the production of fossil fuels and then redistribute that tax around the world. Simple. It's essentially a carbon tax with redistribution built in, which is such a key part of it. We go through his proposal in detail and we debate some of the finer points about, protecting the world's vulnerable or about corrupt governance, etc. How do we ensure that this plan would be effective? And there's something I actually end up saying off camera to Henrik at the end, which is perfection is the enemy of progress. We are getting to a stage now where something has to be done. We're getting to a stage where the public needs to see something being done as well if we're going to continue the momentum of political will. Henrik cannot possibly be the man that figures it all out, but he's potentially figured out a really good solution for right now to incentivize decarbonizing the economy and to potentially Trojan horse degrowth through this redistribution mechanism. It's really, really, really exciting. I hope you all enjoy this episode as much as I did. If you do, please share it. If you love it, support the podcast at planetcritical.com or on Patreon, where everyone now has access to the interview transcripts. Becoming a paid subscriber or patron also supports my independent investigations into climate corruption around the world, exposing dangerous industry greenwashing and the world's worst climate fraudsters. If that's important to you, join the Planet Critical community who help make that happen. The link is in the description box below. And to those of you who are already supporting this podcast and my work, thank you so much. Well, Henrik, thank you very much for joining me on Planet Critical. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Okay, thanks for having me.
Could you give a whistle-stop tour of your career, what you've been working on, before we come to the main topic of today?
Yes, of course. So my background is actually in physics. I did a PhD in theoretical physics at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, so it's the ETH in Zurich. And then I moved to industries. I worked for 10 years in the private sector, 8 of those years with ABB, which is a big engineering power company, which gave me quite an insight into how the energy sector actually works. And now since 2010 or so, I'm at the engineering school in Switzerland, where I'm responsible for the curriculum in renewable energies and environmental technology. And I started giving public climate lectures some 8 years ago. And the reason was really because I didn't really know what to tell my students anymore. Because, I mean, you're standing in front of like young people, early mid-20s, and these are people who are supposed to have a bright future ahead of them. And I was really questioning whether what I'm telling them, because basically we're teaching the same thing we taught 20 years ago, and is that the relevant information? And then I thought I have to tell them something about what really matters. So I started giving public lectures. And the global climate compensation grew out of that, because I realized you can't, giving a lecture where you tell people that we're all going to die is not really very helpful. You really have to start with some plan or some idea how we could fix this mess.
Absolutely. I think especially with the kind of role that academics play in society, like being held as the most knowledgeable. If you guys start saying that it's game over and we're all going to die, then it's quite a disempowering message.
Exactly. You can't do that. You have a responsibility, but you also have the responsibility of telling the truth. You can be hopeful, but you should not try to hide the truth that we are in a very difficult situation, and that is actually my feeling. The problem I have is I do believe that we can solve the problem if we all get together. It's like all hands on deck, and we all need to pull in one direction. How to make that happen, that's a completely different story.
At what point in your research did you become aware of the extent of the problem?
Well, it was. The extent of the problem is, I think, today fairly obvious. First you see it with a naked eye, but if you look at the statistics, you look at how the carbon dioxide concentration is actually not only increasing, but it's increasing at an accelerating rate. It's actually growing faster and faster. Then it's clear that at some point, it doesn't really matter where the limit is, but because as long as it's increasing, we are going to hit any limit. And at some point, life will not be possible anymore. That was fairly obvious. But what really shocked me was that there were surprisingly few plans out there with that were sufficiently ambitious and sufficiently that really targeted the real problem. And I started making this comparison. I think it's actually quite a good comparison. So imagine we are all on board a cruise ship which is sinking. So there are like holes in the hull, and we are taking in water at an increasing rate. So the scientists are trying to figure out how much water the ship can hold before it sinks. And the engineers are all working on trying to design pumps that could keep us afloat even while we're taking in water. And the economists are basically trying to keep the casino open. And surprisingly, nobody is thinking about plugging the holes. And actually, it's even worse, because we're actually paying people for drilling new holes. And if you, this is a very good comparison, because carbon, after all, climate change is caused by the fact that we have drilled holes into the crust of the earth, and we are taking out coal and methane, coal and gas and oil out of these holes, and that ends up in the atmosphere. There's no chance of stopping climate change unless we plug these holes. But that is simply out of the question. We need to close down all coal mines, gas wells and oil wells in a foreseeable future as quickly as possible.
The tricky thing, of course, if I may jump in here, the tricky thing, of course, is when looking at the systems perspective of it, which is, and I think so many scientists are reaching this sort of like glass ceiling of thought, which is, well, okay, we know that we need to shut down the oil and gas industry, but what impact is that going to have on our food systems or on people's access to universal basic services, on poverty?
Exactly. And this is what at least got me thinking, and why I made this suggestion about global climate compensation, because the devil is in the details. And if you can think about what we have been trying so far, has been to say, let's try to reduce the demand for fossil fuels by making renewable energies available. And that hasn't really worked. I mean, it's not going fast enough. We know that. But I think there is also a fundamental problem which people do not talk about, and that is that a large part of the world's population lives in energy poverty still. There is really no upper limit to the amount of energy we can use. I mean, I think the energy market is supply driven. The more energy we make available, the more energy will be used. And that, of course, has been the problem in the past. Now, yes, we have been building a lot of renewable energies, but total energy demand has been increasing faster. So
I find
it
this
didn't
to be
really solve the problem.
I find this to be a very interesting part of the proposal that you've put together.
Yeah.
That key detail that no matter how much renewable energy is still being built, what we're using in fossil fuels is still increasing because supply overall is increasing. And I think that's a key detail that needs to be broadcasted more.
I think so. That is a very important point. So I think that is a fundamental flaw in this thinking. I can, of course, understand why people... I think this approach is mainly motivated by the fact that it's very convenient because, I mean, it allows us to stick to the narrative of growth and innovation, etc. We're going to fix this problem through growth and innovation. And it also avoids a direct confrontation with the oil industry.
Yeah.
So would be the easy way out if it worked.
The transition.
And then on the others, exactly. Then the other way you could of course try to reduce demand and that or supply, and that is of course what some environmental organizations, there is in Germany this Ende Gelände, who try to block the coal mines and you try to block the oil wells and oil transports, etc. And again, that sounds like a very good idea. You should do that. However, it's not that smart actually, because if you reduce supply, first it would be very difficult to do that. I smell lawsuits. I mean, these companies will try to defend their right to produce oil and gas and coal. Secondly, if you reduce demand or the supply, then of course the price will go up. So that means that the companies that are still in business, they will make a killing. They will earn a lot of money. And secondly, the high prices will of course be a real problem, especially for poorer nations. So again, you have a basic fundamental flaw with this approach. I mean, we can't simply stop producing oil because we depend on it. I mean, very many people, our food production, our food distribution systems, they depend on it. So therefore I thought, okay, I think we need two things. First, it's much more predictable to say, let's introduce a global carbon tax instead, because if we do so, we know what happens. I mean, there have been fluctuations in the oil price in the past. We know that if we increase if the oil prices rises by $40 per barrel, that is annoying, but I mean, the world economy doesn't collapse because of that, because that has happened in the past. And if you combine that with the redistribution mechanism that actually makes sure that the poorer nations are compensated, or poorer people who are vulnerable people, I perhaps should say, then I think that will not be such a big deal. And then we'll have to ramp up this tax or price or fee or whatever you want to call it gradually to see what happens.
Let's clarify then. So this is the Global Climate Compensation Plan. It is at heart a carbon tax with a built-in redistribution program. So the wealthiest pay for their use of fossil fuels and their use of putting the planet at risk. And then at the same time, the money that they pay into that fund is distributed towards the world's most vulnerable people, nations, so that they can begin their own transition.
Yeah. So that's the core. And it's the intention was to make it as simple as possible. And one key element is, of course, that the carbon tax should be paid directly by the producers of fossil fuel. And I think that is a very important feature for two reasons. First, because there are very few companies that actually are in that business. There are about a couple of hundred companies that actually extract and produce fossil
That's
fuels.
nothing.
So would be fairly easy to tax these companies. And the second point is, of course, that it's much easier to tax production than to tax emissions. I mean, companies don't want to measure their emissions because they know if I measure their emissions, they will have to pay for it. So I mean, an airline, it is like that. Most companies try to sort of hide their emissions. The carbon that the fossil fuel companies produce, that is of course their production. And they have to measure their production because that's the stuff they sell. I mean, they're actually in the business of selling carbon. So I mean, there's no way around this. So that would make the whole thing very manageable and very easy. I mean, of course, you have to sort of enforce that too. I mean, I don't believe that these companies would volunteer to pay this fee, but I mean, it's the enforcement problem seems reasonable if you could do it like that. And then the other way is, of course, to...
Sorry, Henrik. There's a very slight, like 1.5 second delay, which is why I don't mean to keep talking over you. The thing that I particularly like about production, taxing production rather than emissions as well, is you can't offset production. You can't say, oh, well, yes, we might have produced this, but this other company didn't produce this and whatever, because obviously what we're seeing with the carbon credit market is exactly the offsetting of emissions, which is just the financialization of the crisis and really quite disastrous for any attempts at progress or addressing the issue. So I feel like this almost bypasses that potential problem.
Yep, I think it does. I mean, this is a significant... It will. There's no way around it. And then, of course, it is also clever use of the market forces because, or the way markets work, because we are not telling the fossil fuel companies will probably not pay this out of their own pockets. They would pass the higher cost on to their customers. So at the end of the day, it would be the person who burns the carbon, who actually uses the carbon and can't pass it on, who actually pays for things. And that is, of course, very important because I don't know if you know, there's a big discussion about the emissions from China. On the one hand, China is emitting a lot of carbon dioxide. That's given. On the other hand, very much of this is caused by their production of stuff for the industrialized world. And of course, they then argue that why should we pay for that? I mean, it's consumers in the West that should pay for this. If you use this carbon price, what will happen is, of course, the Chinese manufacturer will have to pay more for his fuel, for his energy, and he will pass that cost on to his customers. So at the end of the day, it will be actually the consumers in the West who pay for or the consumers everywhere who pay for the carbon footprint of a product, regardless of where it was produced.
See,
which is quite clever.
This is something, though, that this was the first thing when I was reading the proposal that I wanted to stick on and discuss, because we're seeing a kind of we're seeing almost like a practice round of that difference in price and how it's affecting people in the West due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So the speculative market has just gone absolutely out of control. And even in a wealthy nation like the UK, there are people that are terrified about the ability or not to heat their homes this winter. We're worried about the effect on food systems, on production, all this kind of stuff. So even in wealthy nations like the UK, the USA, we do have a class of very vulnerable, poor, precarious people. Therefore, surely, creating a system whereby it's the end user that pays in the end. I mean, isn't that just going to hit the most vulnerable first?
It definitely would be without this redistribution mechanism. So the point is, of course, that every nation would then get a payout from this fund. and it's a fairly. So I did this calculation with $100 per ton of carbon dioxide, just to get some numbers, and then of course the idea was that if you redistribute this, give it back on a per capita basis, every human being gets like $450 US dollars per year. But that's of course assuming you distribute it evenly. That's a lot of money for poorer nations, for countries like Bangladesh or Sudan or so. That would have an enormous impact. In Great Britain, I don't think, or in the UK, you would probably give that money to the vulnerable, hopefully. I mean, this is a political decision that the UK government will have to make, of course. I didn't want to get involved there because, I mean, you can't solve all problems. I mean, the point is that every nation gets a significant sum of money from this fund. And if they do not decide to use that money for protecting the vulnerable, well, sorry, I can't help. I mean, I think, but it is an issue. Of course it is an issue, but this issue gets even worse if you look at the global perspective, of course, because, I mean, even the poorest in the UK are, of course, fairly well-to-do compared to the poorest people in like many parts of Africa.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I mean, in the West, we're all the 1%. But still, I mean, it's a really, really big if, because if the governments that we have already are not doing what is necessary to be equitable, to be fair, or to be climate conscious, could this not be another model then that would end up being capitalized upon by the wealthy to maintain their own lifestyles whilst the most vulnerable around the world are hit? Because, I mean, even look at other nations like India, or Saudi Arabia or Malaysia, where the elite are incredibly wealthy. They have such a wealthy elite class, and they're not redistributing anything amongst their own people. So this is my concern when the if is, well, it's on governments to do the right thing. And I know that obviously you're a physicist, you're an engineer, it's not your job to solve all of the problems. But is there another policy that we could implement? What would we need to implement at the same time as the Global Climate Compensation Fund to ensure that it was used in the most effective manner?
I mean, that is a very important and relevant point. I mean, I would like to point out, of course, that the good thing about this plan is it makes the amount the increased living cost that you have will be, of course, the increase will be proportional to the amount of your carbon footprint. And of course, rich people have a larger carbon footprint. One of the big benefits is that even the billionaire at the Bahamas, in the Bahamas, who has like his luxury yacht and his private jet, there's no way to get around this. That there will be no tax loopholes from this tax if you use fossil fuels, then you pay regardless of where you live. So I think that is actually a good thing. The other thing, I mean, again, as you said, I'm a physicist. I didn't want to get too involved in this. I have this feeling that, I mean, one of the problems in this game is we don't have a world government. And it is very difficult. I thought if you want to make this plan palatable to governments everywhere or to voters everywhere, if you say you redistribute the money with no strings attached, it would be easier than to say you will get the money back under these and these conditions. I mean, try to get the Republicans in the UK to say that, and the United Nations will now decide where the money goes. I don't think they would like that. I'm not saying that the other approach is going to. There will be problems, yes, but I mean, at the end of the day, the only societal. We don't have a world government, and it is as simple as that. There are functioning governments government systems, democracies out there. And I think for many of these countries, they would probably use this money in a reasonable manner. Then of course there would be problems with some countries. But I made this point in this in the paper I wrote that we are not appealing to their altruism. That's at least a good thing. So you could, of course, say we take some corrupt country and the government says, okay, now the price of fossil fuels will go up. We take all the money and build swimming pools and large villas for the elite, etc. I mean, that could happen. But it would be kind of suicidal, because as the price increases globally, many countries will try to decarbonize. And that means, of course, that the revenue, the money that flows into this fund would actually decrease over time. And being energy efficient or have a low carbon footprint would actually be necessary to remain competitive. So if I don't use at least part of the money to decarbonize their economy, after a couple of years, they will simply not be competitive anymore. So I think that there is really a selfish reason. I mean, the hope is that this will create these dynamics that for purely selfish reasons, countries would start to decarbonize.
But doesn't that assume a certain long-termism in these people's thinking that currently is unavailable, because they're not only committing suicide with their current ways of governance and policy, but they're also committing mass murder?
Yes, it does. I mean, the thing is, but that I think is also an argument for this plan. I don't know. There is this brilliant book. I think it's really astonishing, The Affluent Society by J.K. Galbraith, and it's really amazing because it was published in 1958, and he writes in this book that, I mean, obviously capitalism is the wrong system for the problems we have today, which, I mean, many people are saying today. He said it in 1958, which I think is quite impressive. And one of the things he talks about is the conventional wisdom. He got quite famous for this. So conventional wisdom is consists of the things that everyone believe in, even if it's not true. So, like the economic growth. I mean, everyone is supposed to believe that we need economic growth and it has to go on forever. Of course, everyone knows that it cannot go on forever, but that's not acceptable. So he makes his point that the conventional truth consists of what is acceptable to say, not what is not necessarily or what is true. But then he says, and I think that is an important point, he says that the enemy of the conventional wisdom is the march of events. That things don't change because people suddenly become more clever or more rational or more altruistic or whatever. It changes because suddenly it is impossible to keep up this conventional wisdom. And I think it is an important point. I made this comparison. If you think about the scientific revolution and the Reformation in the 16th, 17th centuries, which was about breaking the power of a Catholic Church. I think one important aspect was, of course, that this coincided with the European expansion, when Europe started conquering the world. So Europe needed a way to circumnavigate the globe and cross the oceans. And for that, you need navigation. And navigation needs modern astronomy. So it was not possible to keep up the old worldview anymore, because it was simply not compatible with reality. And this is why I think, I mean, I totally agree with all people who say we need we have to rethink our ways completely. I'm also convinced that we need degrowth. I'm just skeptical that people decide to do that without feeling a real pressure to do so. I mean, and on the other hand, I think people are very adaptable and very good at rationalizing things. So we know that. I mean, we in a way, this is a problem we have because people are getting, in a way, we are getting used to climate change. We're getting, people adapt. People, I mean, we used to be able to do that, but now we can't do that anymore. Okay, so let's do something else instead. And we don't really see that this is a fundamental problem. But I think one could turn that to our advantage and say, so if we now suddenly, it becomes too expensive to fly because you can't fly on vacation because the fuel prices are too high. I don't think most people would go around, like sit around for weeks bemoaning the fact that they can't afford flying. And most of them would say, okay, so let's do something else instead.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it is about creating a reality where the rational choice will be to stop using fossil fuels. I mean, that's what I hope that this plan could actually achieve.
It's so interesting how few companies there are that are producing fossil fuels, a couple of hundred in the world. Given, I mean, we know and we see that there definitely is a system of elites and a system of wealth that pushes levers around the world and, you know, tend to get their way, the oligarchs. But that just seems like a much more manageable kind of vision. Like, you print out 300 names of these companies that are essentially putting the entire planet at risk. And whether or not that, and I think in that respect as well, it's all right to isolate them out with the concept of like, well, you know, they support the food system and it just seems like so much more manageable to think about them and their actions than about climate change as an abstract concept that is going to, you know, set the world on fire in 2030, which I think is what is exciting about this proposal.
Yes, and I also think I was inspired by, it's a German, I think it's actually historian, philosopher, author Harald Welzer, and he made this point that I'm not an expert on activism, but I really have a strong feeling that in order for activism to be effective, you need to have a very clearly defined goal and a clearly defined target or enemy. So you saw that with the climate strikes everywhere. So one of the demands was they wanted like the local city or country or whatever to declare a climate emergency. And now you can say that's like more greenwashing and didn't really help much. But at least that happened because it was a clear demand and it was something that politicians could do. It's very difficult to go on the streets and demand that the politicians solve the climate crisis because it's like, it's okay, what do we do now? So that is another aspect. I think with this idea, it is first a very small group of companies, as you say. I mean, so the target, the enemy is well defined and we know where they live and what their names are. So we can, I mean, you can put an enormous pressure on these guys. And secondly, I think it is a reasonable ask. I actually once met a guy from the management team of Shell. It was some event many years ago, and I was a bit naive about it. And I asked him what he thought about this idea, and he said basically, well, I mean, if the rules are the same for everyone, I don't see why Shell should have a problem with that. And then, of course, because at those days I thought there were like the 5 big oil companies that ruled the world, but he then explained to me that they're actually more than that, and many of these are state-owned, and that is a problem. So it might not be so easy to do it. But I thought it was interesting because it was like not, I mean, it's a demand that I think every corporation would know what to do with. I mean, it's not that it would be difficult to implement. I mean, for them it's easy. And then they measure their production anyway. And if they now are forced to pay a fee proportional to their production, I mean, it's easy. I mean, for their finance CFO, I mean, you just have to add that to the cost, and then they have to calculate the new price I have to sell their oil barrels for, and then they're in business again. I mean, it's nothing I mean, they can handle this demand. Of course, they they're not going to do this without pressure. But I mean, it's a clear, well-defined and well-formulated demand, and it's clear who has to act, and it's clear what they have to do. And I think that is a very important aspect if you want to be successful with activism. Then, of course, you have to build up an enormous pressure on these companies to actually do that. But that's another topic.
What impact would this plan have on the renewable industry? Because if the cost would be offset eventually to the renewable sector, whoever was buying it, because fossil fuels, we need them to decarbonize the economy. That's sort of the great irony.
Yep.
Renewables, the price is going down. They are attracting increasing investment, but they are still such a small part of our world energy infrastructure. Could this have a negative effect potentially on the renewable industry? Could this scare people off for whatever reason?
No, I think it would. I think it would definitely have a positive effect, and especially the important thing is that the price has to be. They have to be able to plan for this price increase. So what one would have to do is you have to define this price globally, and also probably define or fix the rate of increase. So you say this is now the carbon price, and this is now going to increase by 20% annually. So get used to it. Then of course people would start planning ahead. And I mean, when I talk to a lot of people in the power industry, and to them it's fairly obvious. You invest in, currently in many countries, the situation is like this. They have to sort of guess what the future will be. So I mean, you invest in a wind turbine, so you have to pay some millions or whatever for that, and then you have to calculate the return on investment. And today it's not very large. The payback time is very long, and you have no clue what is going to happen with the energy prices during this time. And that makes it a not a very safe investment. I think if it were clear that fossil fuel prices are going to rise, so it's a given that the energy price will go up. And if we want to build it, we should probably build it now, because as you say, we need fossil fuels to build these things. So let's build them as long as fossil fuels are affordable, and then we can cash in later. I'm convinced that this plan would be an enormous boost for the renewable energy sector.
That's great to hear. What do you've mentioned a couple of times we don't have a world government, and certainly when thinking about this plan and implementing it and to get the best out of it, it would be wonderful to wield an altruistic and benevolent fist and force all of the countries in the world to redistribute wisely and for these companies to pay up. Do you think that, and I know this isn't your realm necessarily, but do you think that's something that we should be looking at too? If we set up a global climate compensation, do we also set up an international climate tax body to attempt to make this plan as effective as it can be?
Yeah, I mean, there would of course have to be some monitoring, and I think the administrative effort would not be very large, because it really is. I mean, you have to monitor these couple of hundred companies that produce things, and that can be done. Of course, I believe that could be a good role for the United Nations to do this. So I mean, there is a body that is responsible for this with the United Nations. But it's, I mean, you do not have to do that much, because the rules are quite simple. Then how to get the countries to participate? I mean, I could imagine that one could, of course, put up one way of implementing it, and of course this is out of my realm, but I could, of course, I could imagine, like, assume the European Union say, okay, this is a good thing. So we will say, will only, I mean, first we will force our oil companies to join. So like Shell and BP, well, now BP is not in the EU anymore, but anyway, I mean, the French ones would perhaps be forced to participate. And then you could say we are only going to buy from oil companies that support this plan or are part of this plan, and we are going to pressure. And if they are not part of the plan, then we will simply charge them. They will have to pay an import fee we will sort of tax them at the ports instead when they deliver to us. So I think it could be possible to do it that way, and trying to then, so you basically say we prefer to trade with companies and countries that support this plan, and if they don't, then we would basically tax them at the border. Could be one way of doing it.
There's quite an interesting split, I think, geopolitically happening right now, because the global south, I think, generally speaking, would be very much on board with having some of the wealth in the world redistributed back to them for very often the plundering of their own resources and the chance to transition or decarbonize, or just even for some of them get their hands on some more money. The global north, I think Europe, with the kind of progressive image that it's branded itself with since World War II, Europe probably would be on board. The UK and the USA, I can see them having very big temper tantrums about something like this to protect the free market.
But, well, I totally agree with you, of course. And then I was actually thinking whether one should still use these terminology, the global south and the global north. You should probably talk about the exploited and the exploiteers or something, because that's basically what it is. And I mean, of course, the point is this. I think this has been the fundamental problem with all these climate negotiations anyway. That, I mean, you have this split. You have the countries that have gotten enormously wealthy from the use of fossil fuels in the past, and they're still using enormous amounts of it. And I don't see a solution to this problem that allows us to remain up there and forces the other poorer countries to remain poor. I mean, that is the basic problem with the climate negotiations.
Yeah.
And you have the same problem. Some while ago, I actually started looking at the Sustainable Development Goals. And you have the same kind of problem there, because, I mean, they talk about they want to lift everyone out of poverty, etc. And then you realize that goal number 8 is growth. They have growth. And why do they need growth? Because if you want to lift people out of poverty and you don't have growth, that actually means that then the rich country would have to share their wealth. And we don't want to do that. Yeah. So, I mean, this growth was put in there by necessity. So they basically said, so let's, we're not going to give away anything, but future growth we could allow these countries to have a bigger part of future growth, and then everyone is fine. And this is the same kind of self-deception we are doing with the climate problem. I mean, to try to find a solution to the climate crisis, which doesn't involve the rich countries, the countries who, definitely have contributed the most to the problem, that doesn't force them to pay the most, I think will be very difficult. I think at some point we have to accept this reality.
Definitely.
That is, of course, also what Jason Hickel is talking about. There's a recent tweet about him. I mean, solving the climate crisis means degrowth for the rich countries. I mean, there's no question about it. And I think we have to be honest about that. Then the question is how to implement it. And I'm sure, I mean, I've given my suggestion. If someone has a better plan, I'm fine with that.
Could you lay out, because this is using the market forces in order to implement climate justice and in order to, attack the fossil fuel industry, essentially. Could you lay out a little bit how you would see this fund then transition into a global degrowth economy after the vast majority were decarbonized and the fund was getting smaller and smaller annually?
That's a very good question, and I think that is also one important point here. I'm personally not totally in favor of the term degrowth, because why? After all, we are better off than our grandparents. I mean, we live in a society that, I wouldn't want to live like my father grew up in a farmhouse that was connected directly to the stable, and they didn't have running water, and they didn't have, it was a tough life. So there has, of course, been progress. And I think the problem in the past has been that when we look at economic growth, this has consisted of some level, and there's certainly some amount of innovation and clever thinking there, that we actually have gotten smarter and we have invented things that are actually better. Then the bulk part has been simply exploitation of natural resources. And we have not managed to separate this, which I think is a big problem. And I think what people are scared with degrowth, or one of the things that scares people with degrowth is that, like, are we not supposed to be innovative anymore? I mean, what if I have a good idea that is really good and it doesn't use resources? Shouldn't we allow that idea? And of course, the market economy has worked quite well in the past of sort of promoting and making sure that good ideas have been turned into product. So what would happen with global carbon compensation is, of course, that if you have a business model or you build a product and somewhere in the supply chain you use a lot of fossil fuels, that means that a large part of the costs, manufacturing costs of this product will be the carbon tax, basically. And you will basically, if your product depends on fossil fuels, you will be forced by the system to share the profits with every other human being on the planet. That is basically what is happening. So you cannot make a profit. I mean, eventually you can still use fossil fuels, and I'm sure we will continue to use fossil fuels for certain applications because it is difficult to replace them. But it will not be possible to make a profit. You cannot make a profit from fossil fuels, because if your product is very reliant on fossil fuels, then you will share the profits with the rest of the world's population. And most people are probably not willing to do that, so they will stop or try to get out of that. That's my hope, at least.
I think that sounds great. Again, the thing that I'm imagining is like, right, okay, so do we need an international body of something in order to police all of this, essentially? And that's not a verb that I'm quite comfortable using with the climate crisis either.
Yep. Yes, but the policing will be limited to policing the fossil fuel companies in this case.
It's so funny when people talk about the market economy, even what you were just saying about it driving innovation and everything. I think we've gotten to such a grotesque stage of late stage capitalism where, like, the market economy is hindered by the very essence of hereditary wealth and how much of it. Like, the market economy would be better and work much more effectively if redistribution were a part of its setup.
Totally. And I think this was Yanis Varoufakis is talking a lot about that I mean, the important role of the government is really redistribution, because there is a basic flaw in capitalism, and that is that wealth attracts wealth, money attracts money. So there is sort of a built-in instability in the system. And the one of the prime tasks of the government is to redistribute that. But I mean, this is also a good point. I have at least come to the conclusion that the market economy is not fundamentally flawed. But the condition is, of course, for a working market economy. Then we have to make sure that every human being has enough money to participate in the market economy and has enough money to buy what is essential, what their essential needs, to cover their essential needs in the market economy. If we can provide that, and this is why I also think these ideas with universal basic income, etc., are very, very interesting, because as long as we manage to provide that, then I don't see a fundamental problem with the market economy.
Well, also all research has shown that wherever they've introduced a UBI, universal basic income, to experiment with it, it's driven innovation and entrepreneurship, as well as quality of life and access, so it's actually a massive proponent of the market economy. It's just more fair. And so, the heavyweight capitalists aren't keen on it. I wonder then if because there would be no strings attached to the Global Climate Compensation Fund with the redistribution, some countries then could choose to use that to implement a UBI or invest in healthcare or invest in renewables. So what I think is interesting as well, very much so about your proposal, is that it allows for a diversification of investment, which we need from a systems perspective to kind of attack like the multiplicity of the climate crisis, because it's not just, carbon, it's also the economic inequality and energy inequity and all those sorts of things. So depending on a government's national interest, if it has the interests of the best of its people at heart, it could redirect that money where it needs rather than being forced to implement it in a certain industry.
Yeah, and I think this is, of course, it seems fairly obvious that if you want to be serious about decarbonization and we have to take lots of money out of the fossil fuel sector and invest it elsewhere, and this is what this plan does. And I mean, the funny thing, what really shocked me was that I did this calculation for $100 per ton of carbon dioxide, and you realize, I mean, that turns out that we will then redistribute $3.6 trillion, which is a significant amount of money. So $3,600 billion. And if you compare that to in the climate negotiations, we're talking about this climate fund, 100 billion that the rich countries are supposed to provide for. Yeah, I mean, they have been discussing it. It was first, I think, introduced in Copenhagen in 2009. Then they talked about they discussed the financing of that in 2015. And then now in Glasgow, I think they finally decided that they had the money. So but if you look at the details, to me, it's sickening, because first, it's 100 billion. Now, Russia invades Ukraine and Germany decides just like that to increase their defense funding by 100 billion. I mean, this is nothing. I mean, it's far too little. I mean, there's at least one zero missing on that number. It should be like more 1,000 billion. Secondly, if you look at how they provide this funding, it is most of the countries do it through loans. So they say, yes, we will actually lend you the money, but you have to pay it back somehow. Or many countries, I think even Switzerland did this, I mean, that they basically relabeled their foreign aid budgets. So they took their foreign aid budgets and relabeled them to so they didn't actually have to cash out any extra money. So compared to that, this global climate compensation, if you implemented that, but you would say it's like 30 times more money would flow to the global south. I think they would be fairly happy with that.
Massively.
No, and even if all of it is not well spent, I think it's difficult to make the argument that they will be worse off when they get all this money.
Okay, honestly, just with the level of corruption that does exist in the world, I'm thinking in particular like one of the countries that I do a lot of investigating in. I could see those bastards just pocketing it all and then using it to invest in the equally destructive industries that they are home to. But they were going to find that money anyway from somewhere on the market economy. So And also what's quite exciting is how this could galvanize populations as well into becoming more politically active. If there's a global climate compensation fund that's available and citizens are aware that their government is not redistributing the money that they know is coming into the country, then perhaps that would be an upswing for opposition parties around the world or for leftist parties around the world. It would be a very easy thing to say this is number one on our manifesto.
Yeah. And it is actually, I think that is an important difference. I think it was Jason Hickel who wrote about this in one of his books about corruption. I mean, it takes two to participate in corruption. I mean, it's easy to talk about these poor nations, they're so corrupt. But the money that is being provided for this to them is, of course, these are like men in dark suits that bring suitcases full of newly printed dollar bills. It's easy to corrupt people that way. Of course, this fund, that would be very I think the only way to defeat corruption is transparency. Yes. And in this case, it would be very public, very official that on this day, the government of country so-and-so received this amount of dollars from the United Nations, and it was paid onto this account.
Yes.
And then it becomes a bit more difficult to hide that money again. And as you say, the opposition politicians would then clearly ask what happened to all this money you received.
I mean, to me, this is the thing that we need to get people, the thing to get people excited in politics again is more international cooperation, whether it's global or pan-European or whatever. And I think having a singular global policy that is, as you say, there's no extra accounting on top. It is just laying out the figures that we have more transparently and redirecting some money. We have the infrastructure in place already to do it. I think it could just be exciting enough to get people believing again in I don't know, our capacity to change or confront a problem or just in politics once more, because it's all fine and well for academics to figure out the numbers and solutions and what needs to be done. But we also need to be creating politicians around the world that are willing to implement them, and then also people that are willing to vote those politicians in.
Yeah. And that is, of course, I think, a very interesting point, because I claim that this idea is testable, because it doesn't involve much administration, because it's so easy to implement if the political will is there. I mean, okay, so perhaps $100 per barrel of oil is too much. I mean, or $100 per ton of carbon dioxide. Let's take 20.
What is a ton? Could you just
I mean, ton, it's just a metric ton, so it's 1,000 kilos of...
Yeah. No, I know it's a metric ton, but like, what does that mean in terms of emissions?
It's a good point. I think flying to New York and back from London, I guess, is 2 tons or something of emissions.
Okay. So that's still pretty cheap, actually, $100 per ton.
So you would add $200 to fly to... Or, I mean, it would add like some 40... some perhaps 40 cents or so, 30, 40 cents to a liter of gas or something. So, I mean, it's not... Yes, it would be significant, but it wouldn't be completely absurd. I mean, you can do this calculation. But the point is, so like $100 per ton of CO2 would add like $40, I think, to a barrel of oil. And that's significant. If you start with 20, I mean, then we're down to less than $10 per barrel of oil. And if you look at oil prices over history, they have fluctuated by far more than that. So, I mean, no one can complain that this is going to be the end of the world or going to destroy the economy. So it's a testable plan. Let's do it. See what happens. Because after all, at the moment we are conducting like a uncontrolled, irreversible experiment with the whole planet. That doesn't seem like a very clever idea. Here we have a chance to do like a controlled, reversible experiment. If we see that it doesn't work somehow, or that there are some unintended consequences, well, okay, then we go back to the old system, or we scrap the plan. I mean, it is like, I don't see what we have to lose by introducing this plan, even if we do it at the low level.
Yeah. So tell me, have you gone and approached any political groups, parties, figures with this? Has there been any feedback?
I have I'm working on it. I haven't been very successful. I have to admit that. I would love to have some economists looking into this, because I think it's also interesting enough just to have a look at what would the effect be on the global economy of such a plan. I've talked to lots of some charities and environmental organizations, etc., and they have looked into it. So I mean, I don't have too many direct contacts with politicians, but typically these NGOs and environmental organizations have. So I'm trying to approach politicians that way. And but in a way, I don't think politicians will do this voluntarily, because at least not in the Western world. I mean, and I don't have too much contact in the global South, unfortunately. But because the problem is, of course, as you say, I mean, it will hurt the rich countries. I mean, that's the whole point. I mean, the rich guys will have to pay, but they will have to pay up anyway at some point. So, but therefore, I don't expect like politicians in the rich countries to sort of volunteer to implement this plan without significant pressure from like NGOs and activists, etc. So this is what I think. I think we have to approach the problem from that side.
All right. Well, if there's any European Western politicians listening and you think that this is a good plan, please do reach out to Henrik and let's get the ball rolling on this. Henrik, where can people contact you or learn more about this?
So I have a blog on Substack, which is called, so it's called global-climate-compensation.org. So I think it's fairly easy to find. And I'm trying to publish things about it there. And of course, I'd love it if people get in touch.
Great. And my final question, of course, is who would you like to platform?
Yeah, I've been thinking of this. I think Václav Smil, or however you pronounce it, I think would be interesting, because he seems to be a very knowledgeable person about like the situation we are in. Otherwise, I was thinking about, if you want to get more like a societal perspective, people like Chris Hedges could be interesting. The American journalist who is, I mean, he's an expert on what's wrong with our society, at least. So that could be an interesting perspective. He's not like a climate expert, but if you want someone to criticize capitalism, he would be the go-to guy.
Excellent. I will reach out to both of them. Henrik, thank you so much for your time. It was such a pleasure. And thank you for introducing the Global Climate Compensation Fund.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
If you want to learn more about global climate compensation or read today's interview transcript, I've put links to both in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to this channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. If you loved it, support Planet Critical on Patreon. The link is also in the description box below. Supporting the podcast also directly supports my climate corruption investigations, so a huge thank you to the Planet Critical community. None of this work would be possible without you all. Thank you all for listening. See you next week.